Friends, great to have you all here. Thanks for coming. My name is Sam Heath, and I work with Equal Justice USA, and this is In the Movement. So, this is a webinar series that I realize, in our fourth year of, where the goal is to engage and elevate individuals and groups that are doing work in the justice movement. So, I work with Equal Justice USA, and we're a national nonprofit. We do work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And in this space, there are a couple of things that we hold before we dive into our speakers, our guests, our topic, all of those things. Here we talk about mass incarceration. It's something that comes up because we often look at things that relate to the criminal legal system as a whole. But it's really important that we look at mass incarceration as a symptom of something rather than the actual problem itself. Mass incarceration is a reaction to fear. Mass incarceration and all the parts and pieces of it. It's a fear-based reaction to an other, a capital O. Often it's a person or an idea that we've ostracized or put out. And what we want to do in this space is think about not just harm was done, but what does healing look like? And our criminal legal system has very few tools. Now, this isn't only a Christian space, but we're often talking to Christians and people of faith in general. And one thing that really stands out is within the Christian Bible, and even if we go all the way back and include the Hebrew Bible as well as a whole, the most repeated commandment is do not fear. And the New Testament talks about perfect love casts out fear. And so we want to think about that idea of what is it that we are afraid of when we're called into or brought into conflict? What does it look like to actually resolve conflict by confronting it and leaning in with a certain posture, not one of fear or control, but one of healing? So that's what we're looking at as a whole in all sorts of different ways with dozens of people over these years. And so today we're talking about what is restorative justice and what is restorative practices? What do they look like in our everyday life? So a couple logistics, and then we'll talk about who's here to chat and share with us. So everything that we say here will be recorded. You'll get a link if you've registered, you'll get a link to this on YouTube and Spotify so you can watch and or listen to it. And we'll save about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have questions that come up for you that you want to ask our guests, feel free to either put those directly in the chat or you can put those in the Q&A feature. At the bottom, if you click on the dots, or you might already see Q&A down there, you can type in questions there, and we'll come back to those at the end. But again, thanks for being here. So I see some of you doing this in the chat, which is wonderful. If you'd like, feel free to share your name. If you're with an organization or with a church, feel free to put that there, but especially your location. It's always fun to see where people are across the country and sometimes in other places, but great to have all of you here. So I want to introduce our two guests. So we have two individuals who are here that are from Equal Justice USA's Restorative Justice Project. And so we have Jazz or Jasmine Story and Cymone Fuller here. And I'll let them give a quick intro for each of them, and then we'll move into our conversation. Cymone, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Sam, and thank you to everybody for taking time out of your days to join us for this hour. My name is Cymone Fuller. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve you as the Senior Director of our Restorative Justice work at Equal Justice USA. Um, I am very honored to serve in this role and help guide the work of our restorative justice um, field for expanding restorative justice diversion with an incredible team. I also come to you as a daughter and an older sister. I am somebody who is a deep lover of nature and movement outside. I really enjoy asking questions and creating spaces where people can lean into their curiosity. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Jazz.
Hello, everyone. I'm loving seeing where all of you all are coming from. I'm also loving seeing some familiar names and faces. My name is Jasmine Story. You can call me Jazz. Everybody does. I use the they series pronouns, and I serve you as the Restorative Justice Director here at Equal Justice USA. I'm a part of an amazing team headed up by Cymone. And today I'm very much sitting, feeling very much like my grandfather's child in this conversation today. I think a lot of my childhood is feeling really loud as we come into this conversation, particularly for this audience. And I'm very excited to talk about where alignment felt very loud for me in this work and where that might have been rooted in. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Sam.
Ooh, Jazz, I really like the way you put it of what did you say, your childhood being loud in this space in this moment. Some of you know that the other half of this room, not the awesome bookshelf behind me, but in front of me is my son's bedroom. So I'm always thinking about my kids and the home that we're trying to create. And as we talk about restorative practices, that's right there at the center of all of this. So for those listening and watching, this is a special and unique webinar. We haven't done this often where not only are Cymone and Jazz leading these things in their fields, but they're also colleagues with me at EJUSA. And so in the past, you've gotten to hear from some other colleagues. Will and Mona came a few years ago to talk about ecosystems. Our executive director, Jami Hodge, has come as well. But they're coming to talk about kind of, I want you to think of these things in kind of a couple buckets. There's restorative justice and the Restorative Justice Project proper. But there's also above that restorative practices in general. I mean, we're going to hold different parts and pieces of all of that. And you all heard me say it at the beginning. When I talk about EJUSA, in most spaces, there's a lot of ways to say what we do. I usually name the three buckets of what we do. I mean, if I talk broadly, I'd say we want people healed. But if I'm naming kind of the issues, I really focus on death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And all of those relate. Sometimes we talk about the arrows of the down arrow being we want to decrease the way that the system or the criminal legal system is harmful or culture is harmful. That would be like ending the death penalty. The up arrow is, well, what do we do when we remove something? We have to replace it with something. We replace it with safety and healing. And restorative practices and restorative justice is a piece of that. So a little over a year ago, EJUSA welcomed the Restorative Justice Project, and it was a team that came in from another organization, and there's been beautiful growth and change and integration with that team into Equal Justice USA as a whole. I was especially thrilled because I'd been talking about restorative justice and a theology of it from a Christian perspective and pointing to our group here in Charlottesville, Central Virginia, Community Justice that's been in this space on In the Movement before. And then they came and now we've got the experts and we've got all of these groups doing it, and we can really integrate this work so much more within it. And that's a lot of what Cymone and Jazz do. So where I want to start with things is, how would you all talk about what the Restorative Justice Project is?
Sounds like a good place to start. One thing that I think is really important as we start to describe the work that we do is that wherever possible, we bring in the voices of the people that we get to work with, and the partners that we have across the country. And so I would love to start exploring the answer to this question by inviting in those voices through a quick video. I know Sam is pulling that up for all of us, but this video really speaks to the work that we do from the perspective of the partners who we get to work with every day, who are doing this on the ground in their communities. So I will pause to let them speak.
The way that we're going about addressing harm and addressing crime and addressing violence is deeply flawed. It exacerbates the situation. It's not stopping the violence. As the sentencing goes up, so does the violence. There's a different way to address this.
There's been so much harm from punishing people, and it's such an old way of being. Like, it goes back into our times of slavery. More harm is being caused, and nothing's getting resolved.
At EJUSA, we are working with communities across the country to develop restorative justice diversion programs that support healing and accountability. From California to Philadelphia, from Nashville to New Orleans, EJUSA is working with a network of partners to show that restorative justice is a more impactful way to build communities and keep them safe.
It's just such a step forward in terms of what we do as regards prosecution, to recognize that we have to figure out how to make people both better on the one hand, that is people who do bad things, but also how to restore people back who were victims.
It's 4 areas of harm that we were looking to address. That's the one that we have to ourselves, to our family, to our person harm, and to our community. So we bring in people into the space that are stakeholders that are going to help hold the youth accountable.
We help them learn what it means to account for harm that they've caused. It's not just looking at another person and saying, I'm gonna do something to you and therefore that's accountability. I held you accountable. No, we must have processes that invite people to learn what it means to account for what they have done.
I had to own up to what I did, speak about what I did, meet the person that was harmed in the instance, and you had to look that person in their face, accept that, and go about it, and that was the only way for it to be complete. It was part of the plan. Like, y'all just told me what I did, and yeah, it hurt knowing y'all just like, yeah, you did that, but you gotta hear it.
Everybody deserves second chances and redemption. Even if you feel like they don't deserve that second chance, do it for yourself.
Mistakes happen, and a part of being a person in the community is to step up and make that mistake right. Do better the next time. Help the person that you hurt and the community at large.
I get pushback a lot. Like, well, you're just slapping people on the wrist. You're not doing anything. And I said, but our crime rates for our juveniles are down. In 2013, we were arresting about 4,000 kids a year, if not more. At the end of 2021, that number was down to 1,000. And that means that we're doing a lot of intervention and prevention work so that it doesn't get that way.
More than just about repairing the harm or reconciling differences around this specific incident. It's also about sowing the seeds that could turn into something transformative that could change the situations and the conditions that's breeding violence and victimization in our community.
Thank you, Sam. And for those that are curious, we have dropped the link in the chat. Thank you to those that asked for it and named how excited they are to share it with others. This video is one that I always love to come back to, and hearing the voices of the people that we get to work with all of the time. There's just such a gift. They're incredible people across the country. I hope you saw on that map, maybe some folks in the room recognize where they live or places they're close to connect to some of the folks who are doing this work. But our work as a team for the Restorative Justice Project at Equal Justice USA really is to help support the development of and the spread of that opportunity to access restorative justice for communities across the country. Our project actually started over a decade ago. Based in the Bay Area in Oakland, California, the founder of our project, Sujatha Valiga, really had spent a lot of time working as an attorney in the legal system with the goal of supporting survivors of harm to, be able to have access to healing, to process what had happened to them, and to reduce the violence that she was seeing happen in her communities with people that she loved. And in that role, she really recognized how limited how limited the options were in the legal system to actually support victims. She spoke about how in many ways she felt like in her role as an attorney, she wasn't able to see victims as their full people. She was directed to kind of figure out how they could be used to further the agenda of a particular strategy for a case. And it really wasn't about identifying what they needed and identifying what could be done to make things right. It was about moving through a process that really kind of thought about people as pieces on a chessboard, moving them. And in that learning, really wanted to find other ways, and so was able to convince partners in the Bay Area, the district attorney's office, defense attorneys, judges, all to come together to commit to explore something different. And with some partners at an organization called Community Works West, which is based in the Bay Area, we're able to build out a restorative justice diversion program that was able to, after young people were arrested and had been moved to the position of coming to the desk of the prosecutor to decide if they were going to charge for the case, actually decided instead to divert the case over and allow for the case to be moved out of the traditional court process and into a process where young people were supported by facilitators to kind of get to the root of what was going on with them when they were causing harm, think about what the potential impacts might be and how they could start to think about making things right, and to support those survivors of those harms to really process what happened, to identify what they needed to move forward, and then do the work of bringing those folks together to talk about what they could do to address the harm that had happened and come up with a plan to make things right. And that program in Oakland was wildly successful. Young people were processing what they had done. They were able to actually make amends with people that they'd harmed. They were able to connect to services in their community to address what the underlying issues were that brought them to cause harm in the first place. And survivors were feeling able to move on with their life in a good way without experiencing fear that it was going to happen again, with a different story to tell about what happened to them, with a different understanding of what was going on for that young person. And all of that really allowed for people to achieve a version of accountability and healing that they wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise. And so through the success of that work, we've been able to, as the Restorative Justice Project, really spread the kind of bones of that model to new places. And so it started in California, spread to a few more places there, and now we're at the position that we partner with 10 different communities across the country that are using a very similar model to make sure that people have access to restorative justice when something happens to them. And so we do everything from kind of support the community-based organizations to be trained in restorative practices, to be ready to hold those harms that are referred to them from their system partners. We talk to the system partners about how to make that available to people. What are the diversion off ramps they can create so that people can actually move out of the court system and into these programs? And then we also make sure that all of these programs happening across the country aren't happening in silos. They connect to each other. And so we bring them together regularly to share best practices, share stories about their work, and think about how they can continue to support the spread of restorative justice to more places, to more communities that deserve it. So that's just a little bit about the work that we do. There's probably a lot more to explore when you get to questions and answers, but I also want to make some room for Jazz if there's anything that you would want to offer as additional context for the work that we do.
No, I think that's really, really captures it. And I really look forward to digging a little bit deeper as we look at some of these questions.
Yeah. Cymone, thank you. And I love the video. And I forgot that Travis Claybrooks from Rafah was in there. He came on In the Movement, and his was the best conversation that, because of a glitch, did not get recorded. It was very sad. But he was talking so much about how do you come into this work? What does this look like? I also love that at the end it shows some of the places where you all are, and you alluded that it's expanded. There's other places now where you all have moved into and expanded since then. So let's talk about that for a second. And Jazz, how about we start with you? Of how did you come into this work? And we can define that really broadly, but what kind of brought you into this field?
You know, I was really, really lucky that I was introduced to this work at 19 and a month years old, exactly. I had just turned 19, and I was invited into a mediation training initially, and it was held by some restorative justice leaders in the field in upstate New York. And I left that training with this closing thought, I remember our closing circle, we were leaving with like what we were taking away with. And the thing that I said was listening is love. And as simple as that was, it was actually quite profound for me to experience at such a formative age. It started to answer some questions about processes I had witnessed myself in the criminal legal system already at such a young age, and also witnessed others go through proximally, and really start to question, okay, well, if listening is love and my understanding of love is built on a foundation. Really, I was a kid with a First Corinthians 13 mugs and cups of love is kind. Like really my understanding of what love is really started to bring me to question, okay, well, is that what's happening here? Is this love? Like, is this love? Is this how we show love for each other? Those, both for those who've been harmed and for those who have caused impact in others' lives. And I continue to follow this path. I never left this path of continuing to ask this question of how do I show up as a loving individual and community in a way that is relational, and also how do I support others. And restorative justice has continued to be a place where I'm able to see that and support in creating the conditions for others to experience it. And so I think love is what brought me to this table. It's what keeps me coming back. And also this work continues to show me that love sometimes needs tools and scaffolding and support and a certain environment to thrive. And that really, I believe, is the question that restorative justice asks, is how do we create an environment for people to step into that space if they are looking to step into a relational space with those that they are around.
That's what you're touching on, I think, is exactly what makes restorative justice so exceptional in contrast to the criminal legal system. And it allows the question of what does love look like here to be asked and to be answered wholly and creatively, or even partially. It allows nuance within that space. And yet within the criminal legal system, it's so set, it's so rigid, it's punishment based, it's control based. It doesn't give the nuances for who people are. So that's really exciting to hear about how love was at the center. Also the First Corinthians 13 stuff that you even had a mug. But I've also heard, and I'll say you all, your team speak so much about restorative justice as centering on relationship. And love is what's right there. Cymone, what about for you? What drew you into this kind of work as a profession and also as a way of life?
Yeah, my entry into this work, I think, really starts where you just ended, which is really understanding the limitations of the existing criminal legal system. I started my career as an organizer and trying to identify ways to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. And as I was working in schools with young people and families, really understanding how like punishment as a mechanism for behavior change really was failing, and that we had all of these ramps that we were so willing to put kids on to go into this very harsh youth justice system. I then followed that trajectory and spent a decade of my life working to try to reform the youth justice system. And in that work, I've been in over a dozen prisons across the country. I have spent time with young people and families who are found themselves caught in this like cycle of um, not ever getting the opportunity to actually get the resources that they need to address what's going on in their lives, to meet the needs that they have that are putting them in the positions to cause a lot of harm that was happening, but also not giving any space to really make things right. And the amount of young people that I mean, I can think of them, I can see them in my mind right now, that when you talk to them, they understand and are want to process the harm that they've caused. They want to figure out how they can say they're sorry and think about how they can make things right. And as a legal apparatus, there are barriers for them to do that. They actually are not allowed to contact people that they harm. They're not allowed to kind of process what happened with the people that were impacted in the space with them. And that just became a real blind spot, a gap, a barrier to me that I really felt like there's no way we're going to get to less violence, safer communities through this mechanism. This is not how people process. And so that's when I was able to kind of experience for the first time in a legal context, a restorative process that actually happened inside of a prison in Connecticut, where working with people who were sentenced to life in prison, and the correctional officers that were, housed or that were guarding the units that they were housed on, they were sitting in circle together. And I was sitting in those circles with them, witnessing them process harm that they had caused to each other, really think about what it would look like to make amends for that harm and collectively move together for a shared mission. Their goal was to try to support the young people, the young adults that were in that prison, to return home and be in a better position when they went home to not come back. And that shared mission, that opportunity to make amends and figure out what they could do to make things better for a community that they cared about moving forward. That was the first opportunity that I had seen for a process that could make a difference, that could really make change happen and align with the things that I care about in the world, which is safety. I do really care that we are all safe and that we have what we need to be safe. And restorative justice was the only process that I had experienced that had opened up channels to make that possible.
And what makes it hard often, you talked about being safe, Cymone, is often people have different definitions of what that is. I think people often, and I might say even especially Christians, think about safety only in bodily terms and only in terms of the absence of something physically happening to me. But one way that we talk about at EJUSA is safety is not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of well-being. It's not just something being gone, it's something being there. You also use the phrase of making things right, and it's another difference that's always struck me between the criminal legal system and between restorative justice, in that the criminal legal system defines what's right usually as some kind of punishment, and it forces it. Whereas within restorative justice, making something right is something that's offered. It's something that's brought. It's something that's the space is made for, and it can look very different from person to person and from situation to situation. And again, the creativity that's required there isn't allowed for the reasons you said within the system right now. I want to ask about the difference between some language and some concepts for people. The difference between restorative justice and restorative practices and how those relate. We all use those terms a little bit here and distinguish a little bit in context, but let's say, well, how are we saying that those things are different from each other? And I bet it'll take both of you to lean into answering this.
Yeah, this is a fun topic. So I like to think about restorative practices as a big umbrella. Restorative practices are all of the tools, ways of being, engagements, initiatives, moments, silence that allows us to be relational, that allows us to nurture the bonds between us. So restorative practices could be a circle. Restorative practices could be a intimate check-in with a colleague. Restorative practices could be that time that you call your sister in the car because you know that you only call her between the 30 minutes it takes to get from the store to home, but you're consistent and it's still intentional time and it's rooted in this desire of better knowing and better understanding. So restorative practices is a big umbrella. Restorative justice is a tool that supports us in our desire to be relational, but is a tool that really focuses on centering accountability through the lens of harm repair and relationship building. And so when we think about justice, we're often having a conversation about where we're seeing needs, and needs often could be things that happen as a result of an incident, action, or moment. Needs also exist prior to. They might have created the context for harm to exist in an incident, an action, or a moment. And so restorative justice provides us with many tools that allow us to look at the harm that was created, the needs that either came before, created the context for the harm, or the needs that have been created after the harm, and provide us with a pathway to center ways of meeting those needs that feel resonant and rooted for the person who's been impacted. And so the idea is that we are mending in a way that still contributes to us being relational. And so restorative practices, again, would be that big umbrella of ways that we can interact with each other and engage that is relational. And those practices are deeply important for the moments when we need to repair. And so they go hand in hand, they dance together. But I would say that, some dances you save for some occasions and some dances are for every day. And I think restorative practices are your everyday shimmy in the shower, walking around. And restorative justice is that line dance that you only pull out at your favorite wedding. And so really thinking about how we use them, we may find ourselves using restorative practices all day long, all the time. This moment right here is our own practice, the way you have allowed us to share and be heard and engage with each other also in the chat, as well as we may have practices that center on moments that cause challenge or really require a level of vulnerability from all parties involved. And that often is our restorative justice work.
Jazz, you use the word mend, which I love. One, because there's a group in Oklahoma City called Mend, and they're a restorative justice group. I was just talking with them and about them earlier today, but also because the word mend doesn't mean that something's erased and doesn't mean even that it's completely fixed to where you can't see something that was there. And what I mean by that is I was challenged once a couple years ago when I was talking about restorative justice and was talking about there being healing after restorative justice. And someone said, you really should say a measure of healing because there are some things that cannot be fully healed. And restorative justice can't and shouldn't guarantee full healing, but a measure of healing. And I think about that with men. Like we can work to repair and we can work to fix something and we can start to move forward. That doesn't mean that there's full and that there's total healing. And that's realistic and that's true and that's honest. But I think there's so much in what you said with the word mend. And then you talked about the restorative practices being a way of being. And that's great too. Like it's something that's part of our everyday life. Cymone, anything you want to add or jump in on here?
I mean, Jazz did an incredible job of describing that. The only thing I want to pick up on is what you just mentioned around mend. A visual that I love to call to mind when we're thinking about restorative justice is the Japanese art form of kintsugi, which is about right when a pot or a glass work breaks apart and it is restored with like a beautiful gold or silver binding that brings it back together, but it acknowledges and almost celebrates through the beauty of the gold that it was once broken and it was brought back together and it's not the same that it was, but it is something now different and it is still beautiful and it still honors all of the parts, but it has come back together now with the honoring of what was needed to mend it. And that is, I think, a helpful way to think about it. I also think about that, like mosaics are a really beautiful depiction, I think, of restorative justice in the same way. Glass that was broken from different things that once were coming back together, honoring the role of each of them in a new, beautiful picture, right? That to me is the point of restorative justice, isn't necessarily to restore to how things were before something happened. It's about restoring things to a way that everybody can move forward in a good way and acknowledge everybody's role in the shared life that we have.
Yeah. You're talking about kintsugi, which is really resonant. And in the past, I don't know, 15 years has kind of swept the Christian community, I feel like, as they saw that art form and thought, oh, there's so many parallels with how Christians talk about people and humanity. I'll email this out to everybody, but I'm also going to put it in the chat. There is one of the few Christian abstract expressionist artists. His name is Mako Fujimura. We've gotten to meet a couple times, and he's written about that art form and some of the theological ways that it resonates. But I don't know if I've thought of it directly in context with restorative justice, and that's beautiful. And that recognizes all that we're saying, right? Like we're looking at some form of healing, and sometimes we're more holistic people because of that thing that happened. And the goal is not to erase or forget, but yet to think about what moving forward looks like. Okay, I'd love to hear a little bit about something that in Christian communities also really resonates. Christians talk a lot about forgiving other people or God forgiving them, and forgiveness being both a joy and sometimes an obligation. Now let's shift to the restorative justice as a tool piece. In a second, we'll get to the practices and camp out there. But if we're in a restorative justice space, what role, if any, does forgiveness have? Even if it's not a Christian space, what role does that or could or should that have?
Okay, I can jump in on this one first and then pass to Jazz. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that because I think it is really common for people to associate restorative justice with forgiveness, and almost assume that it is an expectation of the process when um, it's not. Forgiveness is not something that is an expected outcome of a restorative justice process, although it is oftentimes a byproduct of going through the experience. And that is because going through a restorative justice process has all of the makings of what helps people really come to a space of forgiveness, right? It's about, acknowledging the harm that happened. It's about giving a very sincere apology. It's expressing that remorse for how things turned out and the impact that it has, and, being accountable for that harm. And all of those things are kind of ingredients for forgiveness. But when you're in a restorative justice process, it is not the expectation that you have decided that you have forgiven this person in order for the restorative justice process to be complete, right? Oftentimes, forgiveness is kind of defined by letting go of that anger, letting go of resentment. And that is not a timeline we can force onto anybody, right? You can have, gone through a process, decided that you have, what you needed to move forward in your life has been met. You have really heard that apology and heard and had somebody take accountability and do things to meet your needs and still be angry that it happened, still wish that it didn't, right? You can still hold those feelings and be able to move forward. And so the idea that forgiveness is an expectation of restorative justice is really one that I really hope that folks can walk away separating. It is oftentimes something that can happen, but it certainly isn't the expectation that you walk away from a process and now all of a sudden you're not mad. You only have love for this person. You can hold love and anger together, right? Those things can all exist together. So that's what I would say. But what would you add, Jazz?
I love this question. I think every day I have like a different answer, and I'm gonna try to go about it a different way than I usually go about it. So everyone just kind of rock with me, if you will. So if I'm think about my relationship to forgiveness in relationship to restorative practices, I like want to go backwards. As someone who has survived a violent crime, I also, because of my upbringing, forgiveness was the thing that I was told to reach for. And the why was communally, instilled in me, the why forgiveness. But the how piece is where I found challenge. And so when I think about restorative practices and what it has offered me as someone who has gone through the practices, as someone who's been impacted, but also what I would have been looking for that would have helped me forgive, I think about really what it would take for me to receive forgiveness. So in my understanding, in the process of to receive forgiveness, the first thing that I would need to do is to reflect. And then after that, there would need to be a process of witnessing. I can reflect on my understanding of what I did, but I'm not going to fully understand what the other person experienced based on my actions unless I witness, which is something that made sense to me. Testimony was something I grew up witnessing all of the time. So this idea of being willing to witness Saul become Paul was something I understood. So maybe sitting and listening to someone else tell me how they've been impacted would be important for me to receive forgiveness. Then change, like good works. So thinking about what do I do to meet the needs now that I understand them? Now that this witnessing has allowed me to see the impact of my actions, how do I take my body, my energy, my mind, and apply it to meeting those needs? And in that process, hopefully keeping a lesson that I can share with others. And so when I was grappling with forgiveness myself and thinking about, well, what would it take for me to walk through the process of forgiveness, it became very, very clear that how piece is where I often was stumbling. And so when I first found restorative justice, it was easy for me to just like jump to connect those two dots. I'm like, oh, restorative justice and forgiveness, because I see these elements that make sense to me for the how. I see witnessing and testimony, and that makes sense. I see good works, and that makes sense. And I see people talking about their time reflecting, and that makes sense. But when I think about the relationship between forgiveness and restorative justice, I do think that restorative justice could be a pathway to the how, but I do not believe that they are necessarily linked. But I can see that in somebody who is at all times trying to be accountable to my community members, that this structure of storytelling, addressing harm, meeting needs, and following up to make sure that those needs are tended to in completion to the point that the person who's been impacted feels full and nourished. I see how that restorative process looks very parallel to the how I was looking for in my own desire, track, and need to forgiveness. And so I think that they are linked, but they are linked because it makes sense that restorative justice could be a ladder towards, but it's not always a door towards. And I think that that would be the difference, that I can take this ladder and these steps may lead to me as someone who's looking for accountability being transformed, but also I can see how this ladder may provide transformation for someone who's been impacted. But what the process does not guarantee is that that door will open to forgiveness. It does guarantee that we took steps. And I think that that is really where I see the distinction between the two.
Sometimes the way I talk about restorative justice is with the acronym ARC or ARC, and it just helps my brain that there needs to be an acknowledgement of the harm, some kind of active repair that the person who was harmed chiefly helps determine, and then some kind of C, change, so that ideally that harm can't happen again. And all of those are beautiful parts and pieces. All of those, I feel like, Jazz, of some of what you're saying is that it's really logical when you go through those motions and movements. Like, of course, we would want those things, which is why the system feels so illogical. But nowhere is in ARC is forgiveness a piece that's required. And so I hear both of you an echo of saying it's an added bonus and it may come, but there is still a measure of healing that can come really with or without that. I see in the chat Rafia sharing a little bit of her story, and it makes me also think of someone I know, Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mom and two other relatives of hers were shot and killed in the Charleston shootings in 2015. And Reverend Sharon has spoken a lot in public about that story, but for her, it took, and she spoke of years to get to a place of forgiveness. And she wasn't able to and hasn't been able to be in a restorative process with Dylan Roof, the man who murdered her family members, but yet she spoke about that forgiveness being something that was helpful and beautiful. And again, not something that restorative justice can require, but the piece I want to lean into, and this is true of restorative justice, is it's really hard. It can be really freeing to move through that process, but also it can take a really long time. And that's one thing that I think frustrates individuals as they compare it to the system where you can, in some ways, move a little bit quicker, but the time that it takes to sit in a relationship. Another one of our colleagues, Erica Washington, every time I hear her talk about restorative justice and define it, she always uses the word relationship. It's a unique relationship with certain, in a good way, certain rules of how it functions that make space for all these things that we're talking about. So let's go now a little broader to that umbrella and think about restorative practices. And how can restorative practices be present, and what does it look like in our everyday life? We've detailed some of the formal processes of restorative justice, but as we're just living our life and engaging our kids, our household, our vocations, how can restorative processes be sprinkled in? What does that look like? And both of you can share on this. Jazz, why don't you start? And again, thinking through as we live our life, you talked about this being a way of being. Well, how so?
You know, I love so much your arc Sam. And I think that acknowledgement is something that is actually really hard to do. But getting in a practice of acknowledging every day, even if you're not sure what the repair would look like or what the impact clearly is, being in a practice of acknowledgement. Like maybe I'm going to acknowledge that that meeting that we just all had in the office got a little tense and got a little personal. So can I be someone who's willing to acknowledge? Am I willing to acknowledge when I've witnessed harm? Am I willing to acknowledge when I have been harmed? Am I willing to acknowledge my own impact? So finding ways to practice acknowledgement is, I think, a really powerful way of beginning to move in a way that is relational. Because what you're doing is you're sharing with someone else that you understand that all of our actions have impact, and creating that kind of foundational understanding or reiterating it in your own actions by moving through the world in a way that acknowledges impact will just start to sprinkle that restorative practice vibe throughout your space. I think with that, a step further would be inquiring afterwards about what is it that might be lingering for someone, what harm may be still festering, what needs are unmet. And so asking questions and being willing to acknowledge that shifts have been made, I think are really, really powerful ways that we can sprinkle a restorative way of being throughout our community. I will never forget the first time I apologized, like truly apologized to some young people when I was working as the restorative justice director at an alternative high school. They heard me say something under my breath. And I knew that I was like, I don't want to watch these kids. Like, I think that's what I said under my breath. And I was really tired that day. I think I dealt with multiple fights, but they didn't deserve that. And that wasn't my true sentiment either. And they weren't just anybody's kids. I'd built relationship with them. And so me having to stand 10 toes down as a full adult and be willing to not only acknowledge that that might have had impact, but actually being willing to inquire and witness what that impact was, changed the relationship that I had with those young people throughout my whole time at that institution. And so just those little steps of acknowledging and being willing to ask, hey, what was the impact of that? I think is one powerful way of being. Also, practicing apologizing to young people will just really just change the world forever. Like to see the shock on a young person's face when you apologize to them just reminds me every single day that they do not receive that enough. So that means we are raising a generation that does not receive acknowledgement enough. I love apologizing to children because I'm like, if any adult's going to do it, it'll be me today. So I think that those are just small ways that we can start bringing a relational way of being into our day-to-day practice. How about you, Cymone?
I love that. Um, yeah, it's hard to add anything beyond the core of what you just shared. I think for me, it invites a deeply curious experience of the world, right? It invites you to wonder why, and ask people why, and to not kind of let your surface level interpretation or perception of a situation be where you land, but invites you to inquire further. And really assume that there might be more, because we all live complex, complicated, layered lives. And I feel like a restorative practices are the ones that allow you to, as Jazz said, acknowledge that truth and step into inquiring about it, and wanting to know more, and be known more, share more about yourself. So that aspect of curiosity is just a core component of how restorative practices kind of live in our day-to-day lives, feels really resonant for me.
I had a counselor say to me once that in relationships, it's important to be curious, not furious. Not never furious. Anger is important. And I think, Cymone, you talked about earlier how we can hold anger and other emotions at the same time. Shout out to Inside Out, because we say to our kids often, I can feel more than one thing at a time. I love you and I'm really frustrated with you. All of that is true. But we also can think about acknowledgement, Jazz, which you're talking about really deeply. It's truth telling. It's saying what is true. And I keep thinking about Brian Stevenson's quote that truth and reconciliation are sequential. Not both just really important, but the order has to be there. We have to speak truth and acknowledge things before we can move into any kind of repair, reconciliation, or restoration. That acknowledgement must be there. We have to come and kind of give of ourselves to that space. Okay. A reminder for people listening, we've got a little bit of time left if you've got some questions that you want to put in. And one thing that I want to ask you all about, and this was a question that came in the Q&A, is what does it look like to be trained in restorative justice? And I know there's a lot of feelings and a lot of answers with a lot of that, but for someone who's interested in leaning into, or maybe even already a practitioner, what does training and getting trained in this look like?
Okay, there are lots of answers, and I'm going to give you my practitioner answer. So this is my practitioner answer. This is me on the ground, bringing these tools to community for a decade. If you are looking to learn this work, your first stop is to work at home. That is the first stop. There's enough information about accountability out there for you to start that journey with self. Your second stop is to find community members that you want to learn from because of the practice that they are bringing to the space. So I wouldn't look for shiny orgs and certificates and degrees. I would look for practitioners that are around you, because one thing that's going to be really important about learning the work is practicing the work. The learning is in the practice. Practice makes practice. And so making sure that you're aligned with your local community of practitioners, learning from them, and also looking for direct places to practice is really important. And then look for your large community organization. So where are the people that you want to learn from gathering? EJUSA is one of those places where the people you want to learn from are gathering. I saw some people put in the chat, the NACRJ, that's another gathering spot. These are places where you can meet other practitioners and you can ask them to work their practice backwards. Find a practitioner you admire and be like, can you work your practice backwards, right? Ask them how they became the practitioner that you admire. It's probably not a linear trajectory. And so I think that for me, my guidance to you is to first start at home in that practice. And by home, I mean within the body you hold, and then look for your local community and other practitioners you admire and ask them to work their practice backwards. You will find your own journey to your practice, and it will not look like mine, and it won't look like your elders or who you find. And that part is really, really important, because it will be that. It will be yours. And so it should be built in a way that feels organic to you, your own journey, and your own learning. And I will pass it to Cymone for more on that.
Oh, that was beautiful. And I got a little lost trying to respond to some of the information in the chat. I'm going to drop a list of the partners, and hopefully that answers your question of how to get connected to them, Mary, to the folks in Philly. But I'm happy to follow up with you on that. But to this question, yeah, training as restorative justice is relational. So to the extent that you are following the relationships that you have in your life to identify the practitioners that you want to learn from, like Jazz said, absolutely. I also think another important thing to consider is kind of understanding that what we just talked about, the kind of layers of restorative justice practice, how it starts in that ability to connect deeply and build with community as almost a foundation, to then being able to hold processes that walk with people through harmful experiences and work through accountability. It's really hard to jump to holding space for people to, be accountable and work the restorative justice when harm happens if you aren't very practiced in just being with community and building solid relationships and understanding community context. All of that is really foundational to then being equipped to help hold harm in community when it happens. So I would just say that kind of be cognizant of the layers that are important to help make sure that you are building your capacity to hold, harm as one of the more significant things that happens in a community.
There's so many answers I know that you all could have for that, and I think you're capturing and summarizing those really well. There are a lot of incredible resources. I saw that Lindsay Pointer is here at the webinar, and you can look at some of her work, including she has a children's book, Wally and Freya, that we've read with our kiddos, and that's been one way that we've introduced it here within our home. But I mean, the way that I apply to my life daily is often in each situation where there's conflict, and conflict is not always bad. Like conflict is something that's inherent in all parts of creation, but asking, what does healing look like here? Who is it that needs healing? Where are the obligations of healing? How can we pursue that? Or Jazz, going back to earlier talking about love, what does love look like here? Asking that and figuring out a way to apply that in every situation, that's living in a restorative way. And again, that role of forgiveness is really unique. I see, Esther, what you're talking about in the chat, that forgiveness doesn't mean that the action was okay. Yeah, absolutely. It means really that you're giving up that person's power over you. In a lot of ways, it's this power abandonment and transfer that's part of it. Lisa Sharon Harper's written a book called Fortune, where she's talked a lot about what forgiveness is and the way that that's released and some of the power dynamics that are within that. All right, I want to start to move towards closing our time and point you all to a couple things and some ways to keep this conversation going. One, I'll say any link that we put or that Cymone put or others within the chat, I'll make sure to capture those and get those in the email that I'll send out to you all tomorrow with the recording. So a couple things is one, please make sure follow the Evangelical Network on Facebook. We'll put up events like this, articles, resources. It's a good space to hear and see more. Look at EJUSA's Restorative Justice Project, and you can see what's going on with them and their work, the places and spaces where they are. And then I'll also say, think about coming next month. We're going to be talking with Felix Rosado, who is a peace builder and who came out of so many layers in a situation into a place of desperately needing and wanting and seeing the beauty of restorative justice. And Jazz and Cymone, the team, know him and overlap with him and are in spaces with him. It's wonderful. Yeah, he's in Philly. And so in the movement, with Felix is specifically part of the Christian Community Development Association's Locked in Solidarity Week. It's their week-long focus on mass incarceration. And so Felix is coming in to talk about his story, how he kind of stumbled into restorative justice, and how that for him now is a way of life threaded through all that he does. It's a really incredible and beautiful story. So the registration link for that is there. I'll make sure to put that in the email as well, so you all can come in and hear more. What does it look like to live this life restoratively? And in some ways kind of stumble through what this looks like, because I'm hoping that you all are hearing there's not a set way of what this is and what it looks like. Jazz and Cymone, I'm so thankful for your work, for how it teaches me so many things each time we come in space and talk together. Thank you for bringing your story, your expertise into this space, and just sharing that with this group. I'm so, so thankful that you were able to come. Thanks to everybody else who's been here. We'll send out the recording and the info. But again, thank you to everybody for joining, and blessings on the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, everybody. You have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your weeks. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the ones you love.
Bye-bye.